When the borders were lifted, there was always going to be a spike. Australians coming home, visitors coming here for the first time, students.
Labor has opened the migration floodgates. A record 1 million migrants have arrived in Labor's first 2 years. Migration's been great for our country, but it needs to be well managed.
I'll make this point. There's only 2 times that more than 9 million visas have been issued in any 1 year in Australia. Both times, Peter Dutton was the minister.
Immigration has become a very politically charged issue in the lead up to the federal election. This is because the number of net migrants has absolutely surged in the years since the pandemic, with the number peaking at 536,000 in the 2022-23 financial year. This in turn led Labor to decide they need to pump the brakes on this because of criticism that the huge number of new arrivals was putting extra pressure on the housing market and other infrastructure.
We inherited a crisis in energy, of course, an ageing grid. 4 gigs out, 1 gig in. And we inherited a crisis as well in our immigration system presided over by those opposite, a crisis exposed by 3 separate reports.
The Albanese government decided the way it was going to do this was by targeting international students with a goal of halving net migration in 2 years. The government said it was going to target a group it called non-genuine students, which are people that come to Australia on student visas, but whose primary goal is to work and access the Australian labour market rather than study. Under the COVID pandemic, the Scott Morrison government lifted all controls on the number of hours that students can work, making the Australian student visa very attractive to those who want a backdoor to the labour market. Some of the measures the government adopted were increasing cost of student visas to $1,600, increasing the English language requirement that students needed to get a visa, as well as a range of compliance measures which were targeting what it called dodgy providers, that is mostly vet colleges that are private and target international students. The government also introduced a ministerial direction called 107, and what that direction would do would be to prioritise how visas are processed according to a risk rating of that institution or that university. The effect of all these measures was to dramatically decrease the number of international students being granted a visa to come to Australia. These measures were very controversial and drew a lot of criticism, especially from the vet providers and universities that had been hit hardest by Ministerial Direction 107. But then the government took another extraordinary step, which was to introduce legislation that would effectively cap international students for the year 2025 to 270,000 people.
The biggest thing that you could do, area where you could reduce the amount, is in students, because some of that, frankly, was being abused. We tried to do that through legislation. Peter Dutton opposed that, so it wouldn't go through. It didn't go through the Senate, so we've done it another way. The second area of immigration is in skills. We've prioritised construction skills. The viewer spoke about housing. We want people to come here who are involved in construction.
Labor's bid to pass the legislation by the end of 2024 was suddenly derailed when the coalition announced it would not support the measures, meaning that Labor didn't have the numbers. This has set up immigration as a key issue in the lead up to the federal election, because Peter Dutton has vowed to pursue steeper cuts still, even though it was the coalition that announced it would oppose the international student caps.
We'll work with major metropolitan universities to set stricter caps on foreign student numbers to relieve stress on city rentals, and that is an incredibly important step to take.
If elected, Peter Dutton has promised to pursue his own international student caps and vow to cut permanent migration, which means mostly skilled and family visa categories, to 140,000. He also signalled his plan to cut net migration to 160,000, but he later walked that goal back. On the other hand, Labor has always been very careful not to outline migration goals or migration targets. However, in its budget updates, it always indicates its forecast of where it thinks net migration is going to go, and it outlined 255,000 people for the 2025-26 financial year.
Third point that we won't do that Peter Dutton will do is the $5 million golden ticket visas for people who are very wealthy to come here, who obviously they're not going to start up businesses straight away. They buy houses. And we don't think people should buy their way to the front of the queue.
Under Labor, immigration has begun to fall, with the latest figures showing 446,000 net migrants came to the country in 2023-24. Though the coalition would argue this isn't enough. The question remains whether Australian voters will be enticed away from Labor over the promise of fewer migrants.